Rain hit the tinted windows of the black Genesis G90 parked outside Hanshin Garden in Fort Lee, New Jersey, like somebody upstairs was trying to warn everyone inside. Saturday night, 9:15. Through the fogged glass of the private dining room, you could see 8 bodyguards posted along the corridor, hands folded, earpieces glowing green. Inside, banchan spread across the lacquered table in precise rows. Kongnamul, kakdugi, japchae, each dish placed with surgical spacing. The woman setting them down wore a black apron and a name tag that read, Nadine. She was the only black person in the building. Park Jun-ho sat in his wheelchair at the head of the table, neck tattoo just visible above his collar, and never looked at her once. His mother did. Igeo wai hugini ya? She muttered to the bodyguard. Why is this one black? Nadine's hands didn't shake. She set the last dish down with 3-point jeonju spacing, the kind only someone trained in traditional Korean service would know. Nobody caught it. She stepped back, pressed both palms flat against her apron, and waited. Same apron she'd worn for 11 months. What nobody at that table knew yet was that Nadine wasn't supposed to be serving them. She was supposed to be marrying him. Let me take you back 11 months, because that's when this whole thing started ticking like a bomb nobody could hear. Nadine Cole was 28, living in a studio apartment in Palisades Park, 2 miles from Hanshin Garden, the kind of upscale Korean restaurant where a single private room booking could cover her rent for the month. She'd been waitressing there since the previous winter, 6 shifts a week, no benefits, cash tips that Korean customers almost never left for the black server. Her manager, a thin woman named Madame Kwan with lacquered nails and a voice like cracking ice, had hired her because Nadine was the only applicant willing to work weekday lunches and Saturday night VIP service without complaint. What Madame Kwan didn't know, what nobody at Hanshin Garden knew, was that Nadine spoke Korean. Not tourist Korean, not I watched K-dramas for 3 years Korean. Nadine had spent 2 years at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, where the United States military trains its most elite language analysts. She graduated top of her cohort in Korean, fully qualified in both standard Seoul dialect and Yongsan Saturi, the rough, clipped regional dialect spoken in Busan and the southeast provinces. After DLI, she spent 3 years as a language analyst with the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, parsing intercepted communications, reading between the lines of diplomatic cables, sitting in classified rooms where people spoke Korean, assuming no black woman in the building could possibly follow. She left that career 18 months ago, not by choice. Her mother, Denise, suffered a massive stroke that left her partially paralyzed, and her younger brother Malik was 16, still in high school in Trenton, still needing someone to make sure he ate dinner, finished his homework, didn't fall through the cracks the way the system wanted him to. Nadine's security clearance, her GS-12 salary, her apartment in Arlington with the view of the Potomac. She traded all of it for a Greyhound ticket to New Jersey and a job pouring water for people who looked through her like she was made of glass. Every shift, she pressed her palms flat against her apron before entering the dining room, a breathing reset. She'd learned it during tactical communication training at Monterey, a way to center yourself before entering a high-stakes environment. Nobody at Hanshin Garden saw training. They saw a quiet black woman smoothing her cheap uniform because she was nervous. The kitchen staff called her Geomdungi when she walked past, a Korean slur for dark-skinned people that she understood perfectly and never once acknowledged. The line cooks joked in rapid Korean about her hair, her body, her presumed ignorance. One prep cook, a kid named Shungmin, did a mock impression of her walking through the kitchen that got laughs every time. She cataloged every word, not because she planned revenge, because cataloging intelligence was what she'd been trained to do, and because some part of her, the part that had sat in classified briefing rooms translating North Korean military chatter while colonels assumed she was the secretary, refused to let any information go unrecorded. She heard everything. She stored everything, and she kept her hands flat against her apron and her face perfectly empty. Then, on the first Saturday of October, Park Jun-ho rolled through the front door of Hanshin Garden, and the whole restaurant held its breath. You need to understand who Jun-ho was to understand what happened next. Park. Jun-ho, 34 years old, ran what the FBI's Organized Crime Division quietly referred to as the Park Corridor, a network of import businesses, karaoke bars, commercial real estate, and cash-intensive storefronts stretching from Fort Lee through Palisades Park to Flushing, Queens, all of which laundered money for the Songpa-pa, one of the most powerful Korean organized crime factions with deep roots in Seoul's Songpa district. On paper, Jun-ho was the CEO of Park Global Trading, an import-export company specializing in Korean ceramics and specialty foods. In practice, he controlled territory, collected debts, and resolved disputes with a phone call that nobody ever wanted to receive. 2 years before this story starts, Jun-ho had been shot 3 times outside a gambling parlor in Koreatown, Manhattan. The third bullet severed his spinal cord at the L1 vertebra. He'd been in a titanium frame wheelchair ever since. Some people in the organization whispered that the paralysis had made him softer, more vulnerable, easier to approach. Those people were dangerously wrong. The wheelchair made him meaner, more calculating, and infinitely more paranoid. Because a man who's lost control of his legs will burn everything around him to keep control of everything else. That October Saturday, Jun-ho rolled into Hanshin Garden's private dining room with Tae-shik, his chief bodyguard, a former ROK Army Special Forces operative with hands the size of dinner plates, pushing the chair from behind. The kitchen went dead silent. Madame Kwan materialized from the back office in 4 seconds flat, bowing so deep her forehead nearly touched her knees. "Sajangnim, eoseo oseo," she breathed. "Boss, welcome. The kind of Korean greeting that isn't warmth, it's surrender." Jun-ho didn't acknowledge her. He scanned the private dining room the way a man scans a room when he's been shot in one before. Table positioning, sight lines, exits, the distance between the window and the nearest wall. His eyes passed over Nadine the way you'd glance at a thermostat, functional, beneath real notice. But then something small happened, something almost invisible. Nadine set the banchan, and she set it in the old Jeonju 3-point arrangement, the anchovy dish at 2 o'clock, the kimchi at 10, the seasoned namal at 6, a placement pattern taught in traditional Korean culinary schools and high-end hanok restaurants in the Jeonju region. Not something you'd ever see from an American waitress working for tips in a New Jersey Korean restaurant. Jun-ho's gaze tracked back to her for half a second. A flicker. Nothing more. Then he leaned toward Tae-shik and murmured in Korean, low enough that only someone standing exactly where Nadine was standing could have caught it. "She moves like she's been trained, not like a waitress. Watch her." Nadine's face showed absolutely nothing. She stepped back, pressed her palms flat against her apron, and waited like a woman who had been waiting her entire life for something nobody else could see coming. Now here's where this story drops off a cliff, so stay with me. Nadine had a stepsister. Her name was Yuna. Cho Yuna, 26, Korean-American, born in Los Angeles to a Korean father named Cho Sung-woo and a Korean mother who died when Yuna was 9. 7 years before this story begins, Cho Sung-woo married Nadine's mother, Denise. It was a strange match that puzzled both families. A Busan-born businessman with rumored syndicate connections and a black American nurse from Trenton, New Jersey. But Denise loved him, and for a while, the blended family functioned. Nadine and Yuna weren't close exactly. They were 2 women from different worlds sharing a kitchen table every Thanksgiving and pretending the uncomfortable silence between them was something like peace. What Nadine did not know, not until the Tuesday night her stepfather called her personal phone, was that Yuna had been engaged to Park Jun-ho, an arranged marriage brokered between the Park and Cho families to merge their respective operations and territories. Busan Syndicate meets Songpa-pa. The engagement had been conducted entirely through intermediaries. Junho had only seen Yuna in photographs. They had never been in the same room. And then, 3 days before the scheduled payback ceremony, Yuna vanished. She emptied her checking account, drove to LAX, and stopped answering her phone. The merger was collapsing. Millions in shared territory agreements, shipping routes, and protection networks were unraveling by the hour. Cho Sung-woo called Nadine at 11:45 on that Tuesday night, while she was sitting on the edge of her bed icing her feet after a double shift. His voice was measured, calm, and absolutely brutal. "Yuna's gone. The marriage has to happen, or the Park family pulls the entire arrangement." A pause. "Your mother's long-term care facility runs through my accounts, Nadine. Every payment. Malik's school fees come from the same place." She understood what he was asking before he finished the sentence. Step in. Become Yuna. Marry a paralyzed crime boss who had never once seen his fiancé's face in person. Save her mother's medical coverage. Protect Malik's future. She sat there, phone pressed to her ear, and smoothed her palms flat against her thighs. The same gesture. Always the same gesture. Calm, reset, calculate. "When?" she said. "Not why. Not how dare you. Not I can't. When?" That's the moment you realize Nadine Cole was never just a waitress. She was a woman who'd been making impossible decisions in impossible rooms her entire adult life. This was just another briefing. Another mission, with no good options and a clock ticking down. The wedding happened 11 days later, and it moved with the kind of speed that only crime families and governments can produce. Cho Sung-woo's people descended on Nadine's apartment, a team of 3 with photographs of Yuna, Park family genealogy charts, and a thick binder of protocols she would need to memorize. The pieback ceremony details. The bowing sequences for greeting each elder. The specific level of Jeondan-mal, the highest formal Korean speech register, required when addressing Junho's mother, Mrs. Park, who by all accounts was more terrifying than her son. The lead briefer, a nervous man named Mr. Han with sweat stains on his collar, walked Nadine through the honorific system for the Park family hierarchy. She listened for 6 minutes. Then she corrected his conjugation of a formal verb ending, the difference between hasipsio che and hayo che in a specific ceremonial context. Mr. Han stared at her like she'd pulled a gun from under her pillow. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "Books," she said. Which was technically true, just not the kind of books he was imagining. The ceremony was held at a private estate in Bergen County. No church, no public guests, no one outside the organizational families. 42 people attended. Nadine wore a traditional hanbok, persimmon-colored silk, her face partially obscured by the ceremonial veil that she was deeply grateful for. Her hands were steady the entire time. She performed the kunjeol, the deep, full-body formal bow, with a precision that made Junho's mother blink twice, but Mrs. Park was also squinting, through the veil, at Nadine's jawline, her skin, the shape of her hands. "She doesn't look like the photographs," she whispered to Tae-shik in Korean. Tae-shik said nothing. He'd been instructed to say nothing. Here's the thing about arranged marriages and families like these. They're business contracts with incense and silk. Nobody checks fingerprints. Nobody runs the bride's face through a database. The Cho family vouched. The Park family needed the merger, and Junho himself, sitting in his wheelchair at the ceremonial table, barely looked at the woman kneeling before him. He was reading the territory maps and revenue projections his lieutenant had slid across the table while the photographer captured the tea ceremony. Nadine poured his tea with both hands, right hand on the pot, left hand braced lightly against her right forearm, proper Korean form, and watched his eyes. They were cold, calculating, not cruel in an obvious way, but empty of anything that wasn't transactional. She poured and thought about the photograph she hadn't found yet, the one in the hallway drawer, the one with her father's face in it. But she didn't know about that photograph. Not yet. The penthouse in Fort Lee was gorgeous the way a prison is gorgeous if you build it from Italian marble and floor-to-ceiling glass. Clean lines, cold surfaces, a view of the Hudson River that sparkled like something you'd pay to see from a hotel room. The kitchen was a showpiece that nobody ever cooked in. Security cameras blinked red in every hallway, patient and unblinking. Nadine moved into the guest bedroom on the opposite end of the hall from Jun-ho. Their first conversation as married people lasted 12 seconds. "The housekeeper comes at 8. Don't rearrange anything," he said. In Korean, not to Nadine, to Tae-shik, standing in the doorway as though Nadine were not in the room at all. Then he added, still in Korean, still to Tae-shik, "I don't need a wife. I need the Cho shipping corridor. She's packaging. Treat her accordingly." Nadine stood by the window, watching the city lights blur across the river, and said nothing. She understood every word. On the third night, she found the physical therapy equipment in the second spare room: professional-grade parallel bars, a hydraulic standing frame, resistance bands still in their original plastic packaging. Untouched, he was refusing rehabilitation. On the fifth night, Jun-ho tested her. They were in the living room, the late-night news murmuring from a television that neither of them was watching. He turned to her without warning and spoke in rapid Gyeongsang Saturi, the rough, hard-edged dialect of Busan, the kind of Korean that sounds like someone chewing gravel and spitting nails. Nothing like standard Seoul speech, nothing an LA-raised Korean-American girl would have any reason to know. "Bap mo myokgo sipo?" he asked casually. "What do you want to eat?" A trap. Elegant and simple. Yuna wouldn't know Saturi if it introduced itself with a business card. Nadine answered without thinking. The words came out in flawless Gyeongsang cadence, the vowels flattened, the consonants bitten off hard, the rhythm unmistakably southeastern. "Dwaejigukbap isoyo? Got any pork rice soup?" The room went absolutely still. Jun-ho's hand tightened on the armrest of his wheelchair. She watched the realization move through his face, not anger yet, but the slow, cold recognition that something was deeply wrong with what he'd just heard. "Your mother-in-law taught me some phrases," Nadine said, switching to English, casual, lightweight, a throwaway excuse she'd prepared in case she slipped. He looked at her for a full 3 seconds, not at the bride, not at the packaging, at her. "No, she didn't," he said quietly. But he let it pass. He tucked it away somewhere behind those calculating eyes, in the same locked room where he stored every piece of intelligence that might be useful later. That night, in the dark of the guest bedroom, Nadine pressed her palms flat against the cold sheets and counted her breaths. Same gesture, different surface. She was inside the operation now, inside the penthouse, inside the family, inside the organization's inner ring. And the walls were definitely listening. 3 weeks slid past in a rhythm of careful observation and quiet survival. Nadine mapped the penthouse, when Tae-shik rotated the security detail, when the night guards switched at 2 a.m., when the cameras had blind spots during the system's 4-second reboot cycle at midnight. She memorized the housekeeper's schedule, the delivery patterns, the sound of Jun-ho's wheelchair on different floor surfaces. The housekeeper was Mrs. Bae, 63, from Daegu, with arthritic hands and a habit of humming old Korean trot ballads while she mopped the marble hallways. She was the only person in the entire household who spoke to Nadine like a human being. Not warmly, not like a friend, but without the specific contempt that everyone else wore like cologne. Over cups of boricha, roasted barley tea, pale gold, nutty, the kind of Korean comfort drink that grandmothers pour when they want to signal that a conversation is about to get real. Mrs. Bae began to share things, small details at first, then heavier ones. "He screams at night," she told Nadine one Thursday morning, wringing a cloth over the kitchen sink. "In his sleep, Korean and English mixed together, sometimes just sounds like an animal. She paused. Her hands went still in the water. He wasn't always this. Before the shooting, he had a dog. A little Jindo mix, white and tan. After the hospital, after the wheelchair, he gave the dog away. Said he couldn't walk it anymore. She looked at Nadine. That dog was the only thing I ever saw him gentle with. Nadine filed that the way she filed everything. Silently, completely, in the mental architecture that the Defense Language Institute had trained her to build. And then she found the photograph. It was in a drawer in the hallway console table, buried beneath old takeout menus and faded business cards. A snapshot, sun-bleached, edges going soft with age. A young Korean boy, maybe 10 or 11, painfully thin, a bruise darkening his jaw, standing next to a tall black man in U.S. Army combat fatigues. The man's arm was draped around the boy's narrow shoulders. They were both squinting into hard sunlight outside what looked like a military base commissary. A Korean flag hung limp on a pole behind them. On the back of the photograph, in faded blue ink, someone had written, Sergeant Marcus Cole and Jun-ho, Camp Humphreys, 2006. Nadine's hands shook. For the first time since she'd walked into this penthouse as another woman's substitute, her body broke ranks with her training. Her fingers trembled against the photograph's edge. Marcus Cole, her father, killed in action in Afghanistan's Kandahar province in 2012, when Nadine was 16 and Malik was 6. She'd gotten the notification on a Tuesday. She remembered the officer's shoes, polished so bright they reflected her mother's face crumpling in the doorway. And here Marcus was, young, strong, alive, arm around the shoulders of the boy who would grow up to become the man she'd married under a dead woman's name. She slid the photo back into the drawer, exactly where she'd found it. Pressed her palms flat against the console's wooden surface. Held them there, 10 seconds, 20, until the trembling stopped and her hands were just hands again. She didn't tell Jun-ho. Didn't tell anyone. Some intelligence you hold until you understand what it means. Her father had taught her that too, not directly, but in the way he'd lived, in the careful, patient way he'd moved through a world that was never designed for someone who looked like him. Meanwhile, Jun-ho was running his own surveillance. At dinner that same week, he tested her again, speaking to Tae-shik in rapid Korean, dropping criminal terminology, references to shipment routes, territory disputes with the Guan faction, a warehouse in Palisades Park that was moving product he didn't describe. He watched Nadine's face for micro-reactions, a blink, a tightened jaw. Anything. She gave him nothing, not a flinch, not a flicker, not the slightest indication that she understood the operational details being discussed 3 feet from her face. He studied her like a man trying to read a book that someone had written in invisible ink. What he didn't know was that she was reading his. The first real test detonated on a Friday night in November. Cho Sung-woo called Jun-ho directly, a breach of protocol that signaled urgency, and told him the Guan faction was pushing into Queens, making noise about territory that had been park-controlled for 6 years. The merger needed a public show of strength, a formal dinner, all the senior figures, and Jun-ho needed to bring his wife. The venue was a private Korean supper club in Midtown Manhattan, the kind of establishment with no sign on the unmarked door, a hostess who required a verbal code phrase before unlocking the deadbolt, and a prix-fixe menu featuring high-grade Hanwoo beef that cost more per plate than Nadine's entire weekly paycheck at Hanshin Garden. The main room was paneled in dark wood, lit by low amber fixtures, and filled with 42 men and 6 women, all Korean, all connected to one of 3 criminal networks that controlled Korean organized crime operations between New Jersey and Queens. When Nadine walked in on Jun-ho's arm, the only black face in a room that smelled of grilled wagyu, doenjang paste, and hibiki Japanese whiskey, the silence was surgical. Conversation didn't trail off. It stopped. Like someone had cut the audio feed. A lieutenant at the corner table leaned to his companion and murmured, just loud enough to carry, Hanyol? Mixed blood? The word landed like a slap wrapped in silk. Nadine kept her eyes forward. Her hand rested lightly on the push handle of Junho's wheelchair, and she guided him to the head of the main table with a single smooth motion, positioning the chair at the precise angle that gave him clear sightlines to both exits and the kitchen corridor. A detail she'd calculated without being asked. A detail that made Tae-shik glance at her sideways. At the table she performed. Not like an actress running lines, like an operator running a protocol she'd learned so thoroughly it lived in her muscle memory. She poured soju with two hands, right hand gripping the bottle, left hand touching her right wrist, textbook Korean drinking etiquette that most Korean Americans her age didn't even bother with. She addressed Director Lim, the eldest boss at the gathering, a 71-year-old survivor from Gwangju who'd outlasted 3 decades in organized crime by being the most perceptive person in every room he entered, using flawless jondaenmul, the highest formal register of Korean, the level of speech you deploy when addressing someone whose authority you are acknowledging without reservation. She bowed at precisely 45 degrees. Not 40, not 50. The exact angle that Korean hierarchical protocol prescribes for a younger person greeting a senior figure of significant status. She ate her doenjang jjigae with proper spoon form, never once making the foreigner's mistake of using chopsticks for soup. Staff watched from the kitchen doorway. Associates watched from adjacent tables. Junho watched from 2 feet away, his expression unreadable. Then Director Lim cornered her near the bar. He addressed her in Jeolla-do dialect, the regional Korean of the southwestern provinces, linguistically distinct from both Seoul Standard and Gyeongsang Saturi. A test disguised as casual conversation. A tripwire made of vowels. Eonujok Saramiya? He asked in that soft Jeolla cadence. Whose people are you? Nadine responded in Jeolla dialect so precise, so regionally authentic, so perfectly inflected that Director Lim set his whiskey glass down on the bar and stared at her for 3 full seconds. Across the room, Junho couldn't hear the specific words, but he could see Director Lim's face change. And Director Lim was looking at Nadine the way you look at someone you've just realized could hurt you. He raised his soju glass toward her. The first person all evening who had treated her like she belonged in the room rather than served it. Some people at that dinner say Junho smiled when he saw the exchange. Others swear his knuckles went white on the armrest of his wheelchair. Nobody agrees. Nobody had to. The car ride home was silent for 18 minutes. Rain hammered the windows of the Genesis G90. Tae-shik drove. Seoul traffic reports murmured from the Korean-language satellite radio station that was always tuned in. The leather seats smelled like expensive cologne and something sharper underneath, the metallic edge of a man whose control was slipping. Then Junho spoke. Not in Saturi, not in polite Seoul Korean. In the flat, stripped-down register that men in his position used when pretense was no longer worth the effort. Neo Yuna Anijana. You're not Yuna. Nadine watched the rain streak across the tinted glass. Anio, she said. No. No performance of shock, no tears, no scrambling for cover stories. She just sat there, hands in her lap, and let the word fill the car like smoke. The silence that followed was so heavy that Tae-shik's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, calculating whether he should pull over. Junho asked 3 questions, rapid fire. Who are you? Who sent you? Are you working for the Guan family? She answered the first 2. Nadine Cole, Yuna's stepsister. Cho Sung-woo arranged the substitution when Yuna disappeared to preserve the merger and save face for both families. She didn't answer the third because it didn't deserve the energy of a response. What she did not tell him, Marcus Cole was her father. Her career was State Department intelligence. Her Korean was learned inside a classified military installation. She gave him the surface truth and held the deep truth in reserve, the way she'd been trained to do. Release enough intelligence to stabilize the situation, retain enough to maintain leverage. Junho processed it. She could see the calculations running behind his eyes like code scrolling on a screen. Exposure scenarios, organizational fallout, face loss, leverage positions, the 17 different ways this could destroy him if it became public. Then he said the thing that told Nadine exactly how intelligent he was. "If I reveal this," he said quietly in Korean, "I become the cripple who couldn't recognize his own wife. My lieutenants lose confidence. The Guan faction smells weakness. I'm finished." He looked at her across the dark back seat. "You're trapped. And now I am too." He called Tae-shik, ordered Nadine confined to the penthouse, bodyguard at her door around the clock, her phone swapped for a burner with no data access, no outside contact without his authorization. Then he picked up his phone to call Cho Sung-woo, held it for 5 seconds, put it back down. "You do that thing," he said, not looking at her. "With your hands, pressing them flat. You do it every time you're controlling a reaction." She said nothing. "That's not anxiety," he said. "I've seen anxiety. That's training. Somebody taught you that." The car pulled into the penthouse building's underground garage. Concrete walls, fluorescent strip lights, the echo of the engine dying. Tae-shik opened her door. Nadine stepped out into the garage's cold air, smoothed her dress with both palms, steady, deliberate, unhurried, and walked toward the elevator without looking back. Junho watched her go. Whatever he'd expected from this marriage, a quiet prop, a Cho family offering, a woman too timid or too foreign to ask questions, he now understood he was locked inside a penthouse with something else entirely. And the part that kept him awake until 4 a.m, staring at the ceiling while his dead legs lay motionless under Egyptian cotton sheets. He still couldn't figure out what she was. The next 9 days were a cage made of marble and silence. A bodyguard named Ki Young sat outside Nadine's bedroom door from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., scrolling his phone with the volume off. Mrs. Bay delivered meals to her room and no longer made eye contact. The burner phone could call one number, the penthouse landline, and nothing else. Junho didn't speak to her, but he investigated her. She knew because Tae-shik appeared in her doorway on day 2, asking for her full legal name. Day 3, her social security number. Day 4, her most recent employer. "Hanshin Garden," she said. Tae-shik blinked. His face went through a sequence she recognized. Confusion, then the slow dawn of a connection he wished he hadn't made. Hanshin Garden. The restaurant owned by Madame Kwan. Madame Kwan, who was Junho's aunt. Junho's own family had employed the woman who would become his wife as a waitress for 11 months. She'd been carrying his mother's banchan, absorbing his kitchen staff's racial slurs, pressing her palms flat against a cheap apron before entering rooms where his family ate. And nobody had known she existed as anything other than the quiet black server who set the dishes too precisely. That information moved through the organization like a crack spreading through ice. Nobody said it out loud, everybody knew. On day 6, Nadine heard something through the study door. She was in the hallway, doing nothing, being nowhere, existing in the invisible way the penthouse demanded of her, when Junho's voice carried through the wood. He was on the phone with someone she couldn't identify, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard before. Not authority, not fury. Something younger, something exposed. "Marcus Cole," he said, "the American soldier at Humphreys, the black sergeant. Find me everything." Nadine's blood dropped 10 degrees. She pressed her palms flat against the hallway wall and stood there, motionless, for 2 full minutes, breathing the way Monterey had taught her to breathe when the intelligence you've just intercepted changes everything. By day 8, he had the file. She knew because he called her into the study at 10 at night. The city glittered through the windows behind him. A manila folder lay open on his desk next to a glass of soju he hadn't touched. He didn't look up when she entered. "Sergeant First Class Marcus Cole," he read. "United States Army. Stationed at Camp Humphreys, Pyeongtaek, Republic of Korea, 2004 to 2008. Deployed to Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. Killed in action November 2012. He paused. Survived by wife Denise Cole, daughter Nadine Cole, son Malik Cole. He looked up. Your father. It wasn't a question. Nadine stood in the study doorway, hands at her sides, perfectly still. The only sound in the room was the building's ventilation system and the distant hum of the city 32 floors below. He found me, Junho said. And something in his voice cracked, not dramatically, not like a movie, but the way real things crack, quietly, along a fault line that's been there for years. I was living under the perimeter fence at Humphreys, 11 years old, eating garbage from the commissary dumpsters because my mother had disappeared and my father was in prison in Incheon, and nobody in the entire country of South Korea gave a damn whether I lived or starved. He stopped, swallowed. Marcus caught me stealing bread from the kitchen loading dock. Any other soldier would have called the MPS. He sat down on the concrete next to me and split his lunch, a ham sandwich and an apple, and didn't say a word until I finished eating. His hands were flat on the desk. She noticed that. The same gesture, his version of it. He called me Little Tiger. He bought me tteokbokki from the Ajuma cart outside the base every Tuesday for 2 years. He taught me to say thank you and I'm sorry in English. He was the first human being who ever treated me like I was worth keeping alive. The study was so quiet, Nadine could hear her own heartbeat. I didn't know he had a daughter, Junho said. Nadine looked at him, at the wheelchair, at the file with her father's name on it, at the man her father had fed when he was a starving boy under a fence, who had grown up to become something dangerous and broken and powerful, who had married her without knowing her name. She broke, quietly, not dramatically, no falling to her knees, no wailing, none of the performances that grief sometimes demands. Her eyes filled, her breath hitched once, twice, 3 times. 30 seconds of something raw leaking through the cracks in 28 years of holding it together. Then she was back, hands flat on her thighs, breathing steady, eyes clear. And that was the fulcrum, the exact point where the whole story pivoted on its axis and began spinning in a direction nobody in either family had anticipated. 3 things detonated in rapid succession after that night in the study. First, Junho removed the bodyguard from Nadine's door, not with warmth, not with an apology, with the specific silence of a man who is recalculating every assumption he has ever made about someone and finding that none of them hold. Second, the Guan faction escalated. Intelligence filtered through Junho's network that the rival family was planning a hit on a park-controlled warehouse in Palisades Park, a facility that handled the physical import products flowing through the corridor. Junho deployed the bulk of his security detail to the warehouse on a Wednesday night, leaving the penthouse protected by a skeleton crew of 3 men. Third, and this is the part where everyone who heard this story later said, "Wait, what?" Nadine heard something she wasn't supposed to hear. She was in the kitchen at 1 a.m, drinking boricha because sleep had become a stranger since the conversation in the study. Ki-young's tactical radio sat on the counter, crackling with low Korean chatter from the security network. She listened the way she used to listen in the briefing rooms at State, not just to the words, but to the pattern underneath. And the pattern was wrong. Scattered approach vectors, staggered communication timing, diversionary radio discipline, teams broadcasting on expected frequencies to pull attention in one direction, while the real operation moved in another. She'd studied this exact methodology at DLI, in a classified module on North Korean special operations infiltration tactics that had been adapted by criminal networks throughout the peninsula. The warehouse was a feint. The real target was the penthouse. She found Tae-shik in the foyer, checking his sidearm. "The warehouse deployment is a diversion," she said. In Korean, not conversational Korean. The crisp, compressed tactical Korean she'd used in classified briefing rooms when time was the thing you had least of. 3 to 5 operators, south stairwell access point, 15 to 20 minutes. Tae-shik froze. He was a professional, 15 years in this world, former ROK Special Forces, and a woman he had mentally categorized as a waitress, turned marriage prop, was delivering operational intelligence in a military register of Korean he had only ever heard from combat advisors. "How do you know that?" he asked. She was already moving toward Junho's bedroom. They came at 2 a.m., 4 men, armed with suppressed handguns, through the service entrance on the building's south side. Exactly where Nadine had predicted. Exactly when she'd predicted. The skeleton security crew engaged in the hallway, loud, chaotic, the ugly reality of close-quarters violence in a residential corridor. Nadine got Junho into the reinforced panic room, a steel-lined space behind the study's built-in bookcase, installed after the shooting 2 years ago, and was turning back toward the hallway when one of the Guan operatives breached the study door. She disarmed him, not with cinematic martial arts, not with superhuman speed, with 2 precise, trained movements, a wrist redirection that redirected the muzzle away from her center mass and a weapon strip that leveraged his forward momentum against his grip. Textbook military combatives, the kind of thing you learn at week 4 of close-quarters combat training and practice until it lives in your spine. The man hit the marble floor. Nadine held his weapon, a Glock 19 with a threaded barrel, in a grip that Tae-shik, watching from the hallway, recognized immediately. Not a civilian's grip. Not a lucky grab. The practiced, indexed grip of someone who had qualification scores on file somewhere. When it was over, 3 Guan operatives neutralized. 1 fled through the south stairwell, the penthouse hallway smelling of cordite and sweat. Nadine stood in the study doorway, weapon lowered, muzzle down, trigger finger indexed along the frame. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs. They stopped. Junho sat in his wheelchair inside the panic room, the reinforced door still open. He'd watched the entire thing through the gap, and for the first time since she'd known him, since the wedding, since the testing, since the cold, transactional silence that filled every room he occupied, his face held something that was not calculation, not authority, not cruelty, and not control. It was recognition, the kind that costs something. "Nadine," he said, her real name, first time he'd ever spoken it. He said it carefully. The way you say a word you've just learned is more important than you realized. By morning, Tae-shik had run the complete background. He was thorough. That's why Junho had trusted him with his life for 8 years. And what came back made him sit down on the penthouse sofa and read the dossier twice. Defense Language Institute, Monterey, California. Korean Language Specialist, Class 14-02. Graduated first in cohort. Recruited by the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. 3 years as an analyst holding TS/SCI clearance. 2 commendations for signals intelligence analysis related to North Korean diplomatic and military communications. Voluntary separation under compassionate grounds, 18 months prior. Current civilian status. Last known employment at time of marriage. Waitress, Hanshin Garden, Fort Lee, New Jersey. Hourly wage, $12. No benefits. Tae-shik brought the file to Junho at noon. Junho read it in the study, blinds drawn, the thin November light barely reaching the desk. He read it once without expression. Then he opened the desk drawer, removed the old photograph, Marcus Cole and the boy under the Korean sun, and placed it on top of the dossier. He sat with both documents in front of him for a long time. When Nadine came in, he didn't look up right away. When he finally did, his eyes were red-rimmed. Not crying, but standing at the edge of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since the bullets took his legs and everything soft went with them. "I told you about the Taeokbokki," he said quietly. Every Tuesday. She nodded. He pushed the photograph across the desk. She picked it up, looked at her father's face, young, strong, alive, squinting into a sun on the other side of the world, and this time she didn't break. She held the photograph the way you hold something holy, with both hands, with stillness. I didn't plan this, she said. I didn't know about the photo until I was already living here. I know. I married you because Cho Sung-woo was going to cut my mother's medical funding. That's the whole truth. I know that too. He picked up his phone and called Cho Sung-woo. The conversation lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Nadine heard Jun-ho's side. He told her stepfather that he knew about the substitution, that he knew Yuna had fled. He did not rage. He did not threaten to dismantle the Cho family's operations piece by piece, which he absolutely could have done. Instead, he renegotiated. Full terms. Nadine's mother, Denise, would receive permanent long-term care through a medical trust funded by the Park family, irrevocable, untouchable by Cho Sung-woo or anyone else. Malik's education, any school, any program, fully covered through a separate trust. The Cho family would formally acknowledge a debt to the Park organization, payable at Jun-ho's sole discretion, at a time and in a manner of his choosing. When he hung up, he looked at Nadine. I'm not offering you love, he said. I don't know if I'm capable of that. The doctors said the bullet fragments near my spine may have damaged more than my legs, and I think they were right, but not in the way they meant. He paused. What I'm offering you is the first honest deal anyone in either of these families has ever made. No false names, no substitutions, no leverage. Nadine sat across from him. The photograph of her father lay between them on the desk, like a bridge between two countries that had never had diplomatic relations. She smoothed her palms flat against her pants. Same gesture, same reset. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded. And for the first time, his nod carried the weight of respect, real respect, the kind you can't manufacture, the kind that only comes after you've been forced to see someone you spent weeks refusing to look at. 1 month later, the reckoning arrived at the place where the whole story had started. Hanshin Garden, Saturday night, private dining room. Jun-ho called a leadership dinner, the kind of gathering where your absence answered questions nobody would ask out loud. The room filled with 31 figures, territory lieutenants, financial handlers, shipping coordinators, and 3 senior bosses, including Director Lim, who arrived in a camel hair overcoat, asked immediately for the aged Macchioli, and took his seat like a man settling in for a show he'd already bought tickets to. Nadine walked in at Jun-ho's side, not behind his wheelchair, beside it. She wore a tailored black blazer over a charcoal silk blouse, her posture carrying the specific straightness that comes from years of standing at attention in rooms where slouching meant you weren't taken seriously, and being taken seriously was the only defense you had. The room noticed. They noticed because the last time most of these men had seen a black woman inside Hanshin Garden, she'd been carrying their plates. Madame Kwan sat at the far end of the table. She hadn't been told the purpose of the dinner. Her smile was fixed and lacquered, the practiced expression of a woman who'd survived decades in this world by reading rooms faster than anyone else in them. Tonight, for the first time, she couldn't read the room, and the fear behind her smile was starting to show through the finish. Jun-ho waited until the first course arrived. Thick-cut samgyeopsal sizzling on the tabletop grill, pork fat rendering and popping, the room filling with smoke and salt, and the rich, heavy scent of meat charring over oak charcoal. Then he spoke, in Korean, formal register, the level of speech you use when you are making a declaration that cannot be retracted, renegotiated, or survived by the people it's aimed at. My wife, he said, and the room went quiet, the way rooms go quiet before storms. Completely suddenly, with the specific silence of people who understand that the next sentence will change something permanently. Her name is Nadine Cole, not Cho Yuna. She has never been Cho Yuna. He let that land. 3 seconds. 5. She is a former intelligence analyst with the United States Department of State. She is a graduate of the Defense Language Institute. She speaks Korean, including regional dialects that several of you in this room cannot manage, at a level that would qualify her to interrogate any person at this table. He paused again. His eyes swept the room, found Director Lim, who was leaning back in his chair with the expression of a man watching a suspicion get confirmed. She is also the daughter of Sergeant First Class Marcus Cole, United States Army, the man who found me starving under a fence at Camp Humphreys when I was 11 years old and chose to feed me instead of reporting me to military police, the man who called me Little Tiger and bought me tteokbokki every Tuesday for 2 years, the reason I learned English, the reason I survived long enough to become what I became. The silence in that room was total. The grill hissed. In the kitchen, someone dropped a pot lid, and the clang echoed through the service corridor like a gunshot. Nobody at the table moved. Anyone who disrespected her, Junho continued, and his voice dropped into the register that everyone in the park organization recognized, the cold, level tone that preceded consequences, disrespected me. And I have records of every word, in every language. His eyes landed on Madame Kwan. The captured Guan operative from the penthouse raid had talked. Under the kind of sustained pressure that Tai Shik specialized in, he'd revealed his inside source, the person who had been feeding the Guan faction information about park shipping schedules, security rotations, warehouse locations, and penthouse vulnerabilities for the past 14 months. Madame Kwan, Junho's own aunt. The woman who owned the restaurant where Nadine had spent 11 months being called Geomdungi by a kitchen staff that Madame Kwan had never once corrected because she didn't consider black people worth the effort of basic human decency. Madame Kwan's practiced smile collapsed in real time, like watching a building come down floor by floor. Confusion, calculation, denial. Then the blank, white-faced terror of someone who understands that the room has already made its decision. 2 bodyguards materialized behind her chair. She was escorted out through the kitchen, past the prep station where Shung Min had done his mocking impressions, past the service corridor where Nadine had pressed her palms flat against her apron before every single shift, past the loading dock where crates of imported Korean ceramics had served as cover for the intelligence she'd been selling. Nobody spoke, nobody intervened, nobody even looked up from their plates. Director Lim raised his glass of aged Maggioli and turned to Nadine. He spoke one word in Korean. Insa. The formal acknowledgement. A bow delivered verbally, from a senior figure to someone he was recognizing as an equal. The highest compliment a man like Director Lim had ever given to anyone under the age of 50. Around the table, heads bowed, one by one, not dramatically, not like a movie scene. The way real submission happens, quietly, individually, the sound of pride breaking like thin ice under weight. A young Korean server, Minji, 23, who had worked alongside Nadine for 7 months and who had once pretended not to hear the kitchen staff's slurs because she was afraid of losing her job, bowed so deeply her forehead nearly touched the lacquered table surface. Nadine didn't gloat, didn't make a speech, didn't scan the room to catalog the expressions of every person who had ever looked through her like she wasn't there. She picked up her chopsticks, selected a perfectly charred piece of samgyeopsal from the grill, wrapped it in a perilla leaf with a thin slice of raw garlic and a precise dab of samjang, and ate. Junho watched her, and for the first time in 2 years, since the bullets, since the wheelchair, since the rage that had moved into the space where his gentleness used to live, he laughed, short, quiet, genuine. The laugh of a man watching the world rearrange itself into a shape he hadn't known was possible. 6 months later, Saturday night, Hanshin Garden, same location on the Fort Lee Strip, same lacquered tables, same amber lighting that made everything look like it was dipped in warm honey. But the name on the business license had changed. The new operational manager, registered with the Bergen County Clerk's Office, was listed as N. Cole Park. Nadine ran it clean. Not because she was naive about what the park organization did outside those walls. She'd spent 3 years of her professional life reading intelligence reports on networks exactly like this one. But because clean books were the first condition she'd set when she accepted Junho's offer, and she didn't set conditions she wasn't prepared to enforce. The restaurant's laundering function was eliminated. Actual revenue, actual receipts, actual tax filings. Junho had agreed because he was slowly learning something about Nadine that criminal empires rarely teach their leaders, that some people don't want power for its own sake. They want exactly enough power to protect what they love. Malik came on weekends. He was 17 now, 4 inches taller than Nadine, quiet in the careful way of boys who had spent their adolescence watching their older sister sacrifice everything without ever once asking for credit. He did his homework in the back office and ate bulgogi that Mrs. Bay, who had transferred from the penthouse to the restaurant kitchen of her own volition, claiming the commute was shorter, fooling absolutely nobody, prepared with an adjusted marinade because she'd learned he preferred it sweeter, with more Asian pear juice in the base. Denise was in a long-term care facility in Tenafly, private room, round-the-clock nursing staff, a garden view she watched from her wheelchair on afternoons warm enough to open the window. The Park Family Medical Trust covered everything. When Nadine visited on Sundays, she sometimes found fresh flowers already arranged on the nightstand. No card. She knew who sent them. She never mentioned it. Neither did he. Junho had started physical therapy. 3 sessions a week with a rehabilitation specialist Nadine had located through contacts she still maintained from her State Department years. He'd resisted for the first month with the specific fury of a man who had decided that his body's betrayal was permanent and who experienced any suggestion otherwise as an insult. He cursed in Saturi. He threw a resistance band across the therapy room hard enough to crack a window. He told Tae-shik, in the flat Korean of absolute conviction, that his legs were dead and no amount of stretching would change the fundamental physics of a severed spinal cord. But Nadine had stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him rage, and said one thing. "My father didn't pull you out from under that fence so you could quit." He didn't throw anything after that. Some nights they sat together in the penthouse living room and talked. Not about territory or shipping routes, or the Guan faction's continued maneuvering in Queens, about Marcus Cole, about the Tukbaki cart outside the Humphreys gate, about a boy who had been eating garbage and a soldier who had seen a child instead of a problem. Junho told Nadine things he'd never spoken aloud to anyone, that Marcus had taught him to tie his shoes because nobody else had bothered, that Marcus had written him a letter before deploying to Afghanistan, a single handwritten page that Junho still kept in a fireproof lockbox in his bedroom closet. That the last line of the letter, written in the careful English of a man who wanted to make sure an 11-year-old Korean boy could understand every word, read, "Be brave enough to be good." Nadine told him about growing up after Marcus died, about Denise's grief, which arrived like weather and never fully lifted, about Malik as a baby, laughing at ceiling fans, about the DLI recruiter who tested her language aptitude and told her she had the best natural ear for Korean tonal patterns he'd ever documented in a non-heritage speaker, about the classified rooms at State where she'd sat among senior analysts who assumed she was there to manage the coffee and the minutes until the day she caught a critical mistranslation in a North Korean diplomatic cable that 3GS-15S had missed. And suddenly nobody assumed anything about her ever again. They weren't in love. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the way the word gets used in songs and movies. but they were something harder to name and much rarer to find. Two people who had been systematically underestimated by every system they'd ever moved through, and who had found in each other the first person willing to see what was actually there instead of what was expected to be. On that Saturday night, 6 months after the dinner that rearranged everything, Junho wheeled himself through the private dining room entrance at Hanshin Garden. The same room where Nadine had set his banchan in Jeonju 3-point spacing while his mother muttered about why the server was black. The same table, the same amber light falling across the lacquered wood like liquid gold. Nadine set the banchan down. Same spacing, same precision, same steady hands. Kongnamul at 2 o'clock, kakdugi at 10, seasoned namul at 6. She was wearing the tailored blazer, not the apron. But if you looked closely, and Junho always looked closely now, because he'd learned the cost of not looking, you could see the old name tag pinned to the inside of the jacket's left lapel. Nadine. Block letters on white plastic. She'd kept it. Not as a trophy. Not as a reminder of humiliation. As a compass. A fixed point marking the distance between where she'd been and where she stood now. Junho reached for her hand before she could step back from the table. She let him take it. His grip was strong. His fingers were warm. Marcus would have liked this, he said. She smoothed her blazer with her free hand. Same gesture, same calm, same palms pressed flat. But the meaning had shifted. The way a word can stay the same word and become something completely different depending on who's saying it and why. Same restaurant, same private dining room, same woman setting down the plates. But this time, when she walked through the door, Junho was already standing. Both hands braced against the table edge, arms trembling with effort, legs locked against the wheelchair's footrests, but standing, upright. For her. Because of her. Because a man who had been fed by her father under a Korean fence 20 years ago had finally found something worth the pain of trying to stand. Some people say he held it for 10 seconds. Mrs. Bay, who was watching from the kitchen doorway with a dish towel pressed against her mouth, says it was longer. Taishik, stationed at the corridor entrance, refuses to say anything about it at all. But his eyes were wet. That much everyone agrees on. Nadine stopped in the middle of the room, looked at him. At the man in the wheelchair who was no longer entirely in the wheelchair. At the boy her father had saved. At the husband she had never expected and was only now beginning to choose. She pressed both palms flat against her heart. First time the gesture wasn't about control, wasn't about training, wasn't about survival. It was about coming home to a place she hadn't known existed until she'd been forced through every door that was supposed to keep her out.